need to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen. I have been a law enforcement officer in Alaska for over 20 years. In that time, I have seen things that make most people's worst nightmares look tame. But nothing prepared me for what I started uncovering 3 years ago. This is an active investigation into something that multiple agencies would prefer you never heard about. The evidence I have gathered points to one undeniable conclusion. The Dogman is real, and the proof is being systematically buried. I know how that sounds. I know you might already be reaching for the back button. But give me a chance to lay this out the way I would lay out a case file, because that is exactly what this is. A case file that nobody in an official capacity wants to touch. Every year, hundreds of reports flood into wildlife agencies, sheriff departments, and federal land management offices across North America. They describe encounters with a creature that does not match any known animal. These reports share disturbingly specific details that the witnesses could not have coordinated. People from different states, different backgrounds, all describing the same thing. A massive bipedal canine standing between 7 and 9 feet tall, with the muscular build of something designed to sit at the top of the food chain. Broad shoulders, a canine head with a pronounced snout. Eyes that reflect light with an intelligence that witnesses consistently describe as deeply unsettling. And these reports are not slowing down. They are accelerating year after year. But here is what most people do not realize. These Dogman sightings are not new, not even close. The Dogman has been woven into the folklore and oral traditions of indigenous peoples across North America for centuries, possibly millennia. The Ojibwe people spoke of shape-shifting entities that blurred the line between wolf and man. The Shawnee had their own accounts of wolfwalkers that stalked the deep forests. These were not bedtime stories meant to scare children into behaving. These were serious warnings passed down through generations about something that lived in the places where humans were not welcome. Warnings with specific rules, specific territories to avoid, specific behaviors to follow if you encountered one. That level of detail does not come from imagination, it comes from experience. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I first encountered the Dogman phenomenon not through some dramatic midnight chase through the Alaskan wilderness, but through paperwork. Plain old paperwork. I was sitting at my desk reviewing missing person cases that had gone cold across the interior region. Cases that shared certain patterns nobody seemed willing to connect. Hikers vanishing from well-marked trails. Hunters who left camp and never came back. In every one of those cold cases, the gear was found scattered in ways that did not match animal attacks or human foul play. Packs ripped open but not by teeth or claws in any recognizable pattern. Equipment dragged away from camp but not consumed the way a bear or a wolverine would. And in every case, buried deep in the final reports, there was a footnote that someone had clearly tried to minimize. The footnotes always mentioned the same thing. Unusual tracks found near the last known location of the missing person. Not bear tracks, not wolf tracks, something in between but larger than either, with a stride length that suggested a bipedal gait, meaning whatever left those tracks was walking upright on 2 legs. The first time I read one of those footnotes, I dismissed it as sloppy observation. The second time, I paused. By the 5th time, I started pulling every cold case file I could access. I cross-referenced locations, dates, seasons, terrain features, and the specifics of what was found at each scene. What emerged was a pattern that stretched back decades, and the deeper I dug, the clearer that pattern became. Something was out there, something that did not belong in any field guide. In the 1970s, a pair of surveyors working a remote stretch near the Denali corridor reported seeing a large upright figure watching them from a tree line roughly 200 yards away. They assumed it was a bear on its hind legs, which happens occasionally. Then the Dogman turned and walked into the forest on 2 legs with a fluid, purposeful stride that no bear has ever demonstrated. Their report was filed with the local wildlife office and promptly shelved. No follow-up investigation. No site visit, no attempt to identify what they had seen, just filed and forgotten. I found that report buried in a storage facility under 3 decades of dust. The surveyor who wrote it was meticulous. He included estimated height, estimated stride length, direction of travel, and a note that the figure's proportions did not match any known North American wildlife. His precision made his account impossible to dismiss. In 1983, a bush pilot flying supply runs to a remote village reported seeing something large and dark moving through a clearing below his aircraft. He circled back for a second look and described the Dogman as canine in shape, but walking upright, covering ground with long strides. He radioed the sighting in. The response was a polite suggestion that he had likely seen a moose at an odd angle. He never filed a formal report after that, but he told the story privately for years, until a friend recorded it on tape in the early 2000s.
You seeing this? That's not a person in a suit.
Yeah, there's a little one with it. Wait, left side. Something's moving fast.
Bear. Big one. It's going right for him.
That tape ended up in my possession through a chain of contacts I had built while working these cases. The pilot's voice on that recording is steady and clear. There is no embellishment, no dramatic flair, just a man describing exactly what he saw from an altitude of about 500 feet. In 1996, something happened at a seasonal fishing camp along a remote river in the Bristol Bay region that convinced me this was not confined to the interior. A group of commercial fishermen had set up camp for the salmon run, the same camp they used every year without incident. On their third night, their dogs started acting strangely, whining, cowering, refusing to leave the tents. These were experienced working dogs that had faced bears without flinching. Around 2 a.m, the fishermen heard something large moving through the brush on the far side of the clearing. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, and they came in pairs rather than the 4-beat rhythm of a bear or moose. One of the fishermen grabbed a spotlight and aimed it toward the tree line. What he saw made him drop the light. A massive figure stood at the edge of the clearing, easily 8 feet tall, with the unmistakable head of a canine set on broad shoulders. The Dogman stood on 2 legs. It was motionless, except for the slight turn of its head as it tracked the beam of the fallen spotlight across the ground. There was no confusion in its posture, no startled reaction. Just absolute stillness and focus. The Dogman watched them for what the fishermen estimated was 30 seconds, though time distortion is common in these encounters. Then it turned and walked into the trees with long, purposeful strides, each step covering ground that would take a human 2 steps to match. The fishermen packed up before dawn and didn't return to that camp. When they reported the encounter to the local wildlife office, they were told it was probably a brown bear standing upright. They knew the difference. What troubled me most about that case was the dogs. Animals have instincts that we have largely lost. When experienced sled dogs and camp dogs refuse to leave a tent and press themselves against their handlers with visible trembling, they are reacting to something they recognize as a predator, far more dangerous than anything in their normal experience. Dogs do not fear bears, the way those dogs feared whatever was in the clearing. Dogs bark at bears. They challenge bears. They stand their ground. Whatever the Dogman is, it triggers a fear response in domestic canines that suggests something ancient and deeply embedded. A prey recognition that is hardwired and very old, something their wolf ancestors knew about and passed down through thousands of generations. I started building a database in 2023. Every Dogman report I could verify, every piece of physical evidence I could document, every witness interview I could conduct. The database now contains over 200 entries spanning 5 decades and covering most of the state. I cross-referenced them with weather data, moon phases, wildlife migration patterns, seismic activity, and every other variable I could think of. Most of the cross-references showed nothing useful, but a few patterns emerged that were difficult to explain as coincidence. The Dogman sightings in Alaska correlate strongly with areas that have high populations of large ungulates, moose, caribou, and to a lesser extent, mountain goats. This makes perfect biological sense if the Dogman is a real apex predator. A large, intelligent, physically powerful creature would need a substantial prey base to sustain a viable population in any given region. The areas with the highest Dogman report density overlap almost perfectly with the state's prime ungulate habitat. That is not what you would expect from a cultural phenomenon or a wave of hoaxes. Hoaxers do not check ungulate population maps before choosing where to fake a sighting. That correlation is what you would expect from a real predator occupying the ecological niche that its biology demands. The folklore surrounding the Dogman runs deep, and it is remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. In the Great Lakes region, the legend of the Michigan Dogman became widely known after a radio DJ recorded a novelty song about it in 1987 as an April Fool's joke. The song was catchy and light-hearted. It was meant to be funny. The joke stopped being funny almost immediately. Hundreds of people began calling the radio station to report their own Dogman encounters, many dating back years or even decades. These callers were not pranksters jumping on a bandwagon. Many were visibly shaken even over the phone. Some were in tears. They were relieved that someone, anyone, was finally talking about what they had experienced. People who had kept their encounters secret for years because they knew nobody would believe them. The Wisconsin Beast of Bray Road became another touchstone in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Residents near Elkhorn, Wisconsin began reporting a large, hairy, wolf-like dogman that walked on its hind legs and was seen crossing roads, lurking near farms, and watching from fence lines at dusk. A local journalist investigated and collected dozens of eyewitness accounts from people with nothing to gain and plenty to lose. Farmers, truck drivers, teenagers, retirees. They came forward anyway because what they saw was too significant to keep quiet about. The journalist published her findings and was met with ridicule from the mainstream press. But privately, wildlife officials in the region admitted that something was generating reports they could not explain through conventional means. Those private admissions never made it into any official document. What struck me as I dug deeper was how the descriptions never wavered on certain key points across decades and continents. The Dogman is always described as significantly larger than a normal wolf, typically 7 to 9 feet when standing upright. It moves on 2 legs with a posture that looks almost human, but is fundamentally not. The musculature is wrong for a person. The proportions are wrong. It is something else entirely. The eyes come up in nearly every account. Amber or yellow-green, reflecting light the way a canine's eyes would, but with something behind them that witnesses struggle to articulate. Intelligence is the word they use most often, not animal cunning, not the blank stare of a predator sizing up prey. Something more considered, more aware, as if the Dogman is not just seeing you, but understanding you, evaluating you, making a decision about you. And nearly every witness reports the same gut reaction, a primal terror that goes far beyond the fear of encountering a bear or a mountain lion. This is something deeper, something wired into the oldest parts of our brain. The kind of fear that does not come from what you see, but from what your body already knows before your conscious mind catches up. Every instinct screaming at you to run before you even fully register what you are looking at. Here in Alaska, the Dogman reports follow the same template, but carry a unique regional weight. The indigenous peoples of the interior and coast have their own rich traditions about creatures existing on the boundary between the animal world and the spirit world. The Yupik people speak of beings called Irkenrat, entities that inhabit the wild spaces between human settlements and can take animal forms. Some elders describe specific encounters with wolf-like beings that walked upright, something physical and terrifying that matched every description of the Dogman from thousands of miles away. When I heard those accounts and compared them to reports from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Appalachia, the consistency was staggering. These were not stories influenced by the internet or pop culture. These were traditions that predated European contact. I traveled to a village along the Kuskokwim River and spoke with an elder who told me about an incident from his childhood. He and several other children were playing near the tree line at the edge of their settlement when the Dogman emerged from the forest about 50 yards away. It stood on 2 legs, towered above the brush line, and watched them with a stillness he described as predatory patience. Not aggression, patience. The children ran. The adults who investigated found tracks in the soft ground that matched no known animal in the region. The elder's grandmother forbade him from going near that part of the forest ever again. He was in his 70s when he told me this story. His hands trembled the entire time. Not from age, from the memory. That kind of physiological response does not come from a story someone made up decades ago. It comes from genuine trauma. The modern evidence is where things get both more compelling and more troubling. In the last decade, the explosion of trail cameras, phone cameras, and dashcams has produced a steady stream of Dogman footage that skeptics struggle to explain. Some of it is obviously fake. Amateur hoaxes you can spot immediately. Bad costumes, poor video editing, obvious staging. Those do not interest me. What interests me are the clips that have withstood serious scrutiny from video analysts, wildlife experts, and forensic professionals. There are at least a dozen pieces of footage that I have examined personally, where the subject in the video displays characteristics that cannot be replicated by a human in a costume. The proportions, the gait, the joint articulation, the way the mass of the body distributes weight during movement. These are details that are extraordinarily difficult to fake. One piece of trail camera footage from rural Michigan, captured in 2019, shows a large bipedal dogman crossing a game trail at night. Biomechanics experts who analyzed the footage noted that the figure's movement pattern does not match human locomotion. The limb length ratios are wrong for any human frame, even an exceptionally tall one. The knee joint appears to articulate differently, bending at an angle consistent with a digitigrade limb structure, adapted for both quadrupedal and bipedal movement. That footage was posted online, went viral within hours, and was quietly removed from the platform where it first appeared within 48 hours. Not taken down by the uploader, removed by the platform. No explanation was given, no terms of service violation was cited. It simply vanished. Fortunately, several people had already downloaded it. Copies exist. They circulate in private researcher networks, but the original, with its metadata and upload history intact, is gone. And that brings me to the cover-up, which is the part of this investigation that keeps me up at night. I started noticing a pattern in how certain pieces of Dogman evidence were handled. Trail camera footage would appear online and then vanish. Witnesses who posted accounts on public forums would receive private messages encouraging them to take their posts down. Sometimes the messages were polite, sometimes they carried implied threats about professional consequences or public embarrassment. In several cases I documented, witnesses who reported Dogman encounters to local authorities were visited by individuals who identified themselves as federal wildlife officials. Their credentials looked authentic. Their vehicles had government plates. But when I tried to verify their identities through official channels, the agencies they claimed to represent had no record of them, no employee files, no field assignments, nothing. These people existed in person but not on paper. I want to be clear about something. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I have spent my career dealing in facts and evidence and verifiable information. I distrust speculation. I require documentation. But when the same pattern of suppression appears across dozens of Dogman cases spanning multiple states and several decades, you have to acknowledge the pattern. Someone is actively working to prevent the accumulation of public evidence regarding the Dogman phenomenon. The question is not whether suppression is happening. I have documented it too thoroughly for anyone to seriously dispute that. The question is why. Why would anyone go to this much effort and expense to hide the existence of an animal? Because once you accept that the Dogman is real, you have to ask what it means for everything we think we know about the natural world. And the answer to that question has consequences that go far beyond biology. Let me walk you through a specific case that made all of this personal for me. In 2021, a family camping in a remote area of the Chugach region reported a Dogman encounter that lasted over 4 hours. They were inside their tent when something large began circling their campsite. They could hear heavy bipedal footsteps and breathing that was too deep and resonant for any animal they had ever encountered in decades of Alaskan outdoor experience. At one point, the fabric of the tent pressed inward as the Dogman leaned against it. They could make out the shape of a large canine head through the thin material. The outline was unmistakable. A pronounced snout, pointed ears set high on the skull. The fabric stretched and held, and then the pressure released. The footsteps continued circling. The family stayed silent and motionless for hours until dawn finally broke. When they emerged, they found tracks around the tent consistent with every other Dogman report I had collected, large canine prints with a bipedal stride pattern. They also found deep claw marks on a tree near their campsite, positioned at a height of roughly 8 feet, not scratch marks from a bear rubbing against bark, deep, deliberate gouges that scored through the outer layer of wood. They photographed everything and reported it to the ranger station. The ranger who took the initial report was thorough and professional. He catalogued the evidence, took measurements of the tracks and claw marks, and filed a detailed account with his own assessment that the evidence did not match any known North American species. 2 weeks later, that ranger was transferred to a desk position at a different facility. His Dogman report was reclassified as a probable bear encounter. The physical evidence was never re-examined. I obtained a copy of the original report through channels I will not disclose. The measurements told a clear story. Tracks too large for any wolf. Stride length consistent with bipedal locomotion at a height of 8 to 9 feet. Claw marks positioned and angled in a way that is physically impossible for a bear. The ranger knew exactly what he was looking at. His honest assessment cost him his field position. That is not how honest agencies handle wildlife reports. The folklore connections stretch far beyond North America and add layers of credibility to the modern Dogman evidence. Across Northern Europe and Asia, similar creatures appear in the oldest surviving stories. The Norse sagas contain accounts of encounters with beings that were wolf and man simultaneously. Not shapeshifters in some magical sense. Physical creatures that existed in the wild spaces and were treated with genuine fear and respect by even the most battle-hardened warriors. The French loup-garou tradition, while Hollywood turned it into silver bullets and full moons, originated in rural accounts of real encounters with wolf-like beings that walked upright and displayed intelligence far beyond any known animal. These accounts predate the movie industry by centuries. They come from farming communities where people lived close to the land and knew their local wildlife intimately. When they said they saw something that was not a wolf and not a man, they knew exactly what they meant. The Germanic tradition of the Wulver is particularly interesting because it diverges from the aggressive werewolf narrative. In the Shetland Islands, the Wulver was described as a wolf-headed creature that walked on 2 legs and was not inherently hostile. It was territorial but not predatory toward humans who respected its space. Fishermen reported seeing the Wulver sitting on rocks, fishing, not hunting, fishing. That detail always stops me because it implies a level of tool use and patience that we associate exclusively with advanced cognition. In Scandinavia, the concept of the varulfur appears in some of the oldest surviving texts. These were not humans who transformed into wolves. They were beings that existed in a permanent state between wolf and man, physical creatures that inhabited the deep forests and were rarely seen but always feared. Travelers who ventured into certain mountain passes were warned about them. Shepherds who lost livestock in specific regions attributed the losses not to ordinary wolves but to something larger and more deliberate in its hunting. What fascinates me about the global folklore is how the behavioral descriptions match what modern Dogman witnesses report with eerie precision: territorial, intelligent, capable of walking on 2 legs, generally avoidant of humans but willing to make its presence known when its territory is invaded. These are consistent behavioral traits, described independently by cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. You cannot fake that kind of consistency. You cannot coordinate it across centuries. In the Appalachian region, the Dogman folklore runs deep through mountain communities that have passed down stories for generations. The descriptions are always consistent: a large canine form, bipedal movement, eyes that reflect light with an intelligence that feels wrong, and always the sense that the Dogman is watching and studying, making decisions about whether you are a threat to be avoided or something else entirely. The Native American traditions are particularly valuable because they approach the Dogman not as a monster to be feared in some abstract supernatural sense, but as a real part of the natural world that demands specific behavioral responses. You do not look the Dogman in the eyes. You do not speak of it at night. You leave the area immediately and quietly. These are not superstitions. These are survival strategies developed through generations of real encounters with a real predator. Here in Alaska, I have personally investigated 14 Dogman cases in the last 3 years that I believe involved genuine encounters. In 7 of those cases, physical evidence was recovered that could not be explained by known wildlife. Tracks, hair samples, claw marks, and in 2 cases, audio recordings that captured vocalizations unlike anything in existing databases of North American animal sounds. I sent hair samples to a lab through unofficial channels. Official channels had a tendency to lose Dogman samples or return results that were suspiciously inconclusive. The lab results came back confusing. The DNA showed canine markers, but with anomalies that did not match any known canine species. The technician who processed them said privately that the results were unlike anything they had encountered in 15 years of forensic work. They could not identify the species. That alone should have triggered a formal investigation. Instead, when I flagged the results through proper channels, I was told the samples were contaminated and no further analysis was needed. Contaminated. The universal bureaucratic excuse for making inconvenient evidence disappear. I've heard it so many times in the context of Dogman evidence that I now consider it a confirmation rather than a dismissal. The audio recordings are perhaps the most disturbing evidence I have collected. On 2 occasions, witnesses recorded vocalizations during their Dogman encounters. Both recordings capture a sound that begins as a deep, resonant howl, similar to a wolf but with a lower register and longer duration. The howl then shifts into something else. A vocalization with tonal qualities suggesting a more complex vocal apparatus than any known canine possesses. One acoustics expert who analyzed the recordings described the sound as something trying to form words but not quite succeeding. He said the frequency patterns showed deliberate modulation, not the random variation you hear in animal calls. Intentional changes in pitch and duration that suggested the Dogman was attempting structured vocalization. I have listened to those recordings more times than I can count. They still raise the hair on my arms every single time. I want to talk about behavioral patterns now, because this is where the Dogman investigation moves from unsettling to genuinely alarming. Based on the reports I have compiled, the Dogman is not a mindless predator operating on instinct. It displays behavior that suggests high intelligence, possibly higher than we are comfortable acknowledging. Multiple witnesses described the Dogman observing them from a calculated distance while positioning itself between the witness and their vehicle. That is not curiosity. That is strategy. That is an understanding of escape routes and the deliberate blocking of them. Other witnesses report the Dogman testing reactions, making a noise and watching to see if the person investigates or retreats, showing itself briefly and then withdrawing to gauge the response. One family reported the Dogman circling their rural cabin for 3 consecutive nights. Each night it came closer, each night it stayed longer. On the 3rd night, the Dogman stood outside their window for nearly 20 minutes. They could see its silhouette against the snow, massive shoulders, a canine head turned slightly to the side, watching them with one eye. Then it simply left and did not return. What was it doing during those 3 nights? Learning their patterns, testing their responses, making some kind of assessment. I do not know what conclusion the Dogman reached, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. The connection between Dogman sightings and missing person cases is something I handle with extreme caution. I am not going to claim that the Dogman is responsible for disappearances, because I do not have definitive evidence for that. What I will tell you is that the geographic overlap between clusters of Dogman sightings and clusters of unexplained vanishings is statistically significant enough to warrant serious investigation that nobody seems willing to conduct. In areas with high concentrations of Dogman reports, the rate of unexplained disappearances is meaningfully higher than in comparable wilderness areas without such reports. Correlation is not causation. I understand that fully. But in my line of work, when you see the same correlation appear across multiple jurisdictions and multiple decades, you investigate it. You do not dismiss it. You do not look the other way unless someone tells you to. The suppression of Dogman evidence ties everything together. If the Dogman were purely folklore and overactive imagination, there would be no reason to suppress anything. Hoaxes debunk themselves. Misidentifications get corrected through normal processes. But active suppression, the kind I have documented with confiscated evidence and transferred personnel and vanishing reports, only happens when someone in authority believes the evidence is genuine and wants it hidden. I have identified at least 3 instances where physical Dogman evidence was confiscated by individuals claiming federal authority. Tracks preserved in plaster, hair samples, photographs, damaged property. In each case, the evidence was taken for official analysis and simply never returned. Follow-up inquiries hit dead ends, disconnected phone numbers, offices with no record of any interaction, personnel who had apparently been reassigned to locations that did not exist. So why hide it? The existence of a large, intelligent bipedal predator across North American wilderness would have enormous implications. Land use policy, recreational activity, resource extraction, real estate values across vast regions, entire industries built on outdoor recreation and tourism would face disruption. And beyond the economic impact, there is the deeper existential problem. Acknowledging the Dogman means admitting we do not understand our own environment nearly as well as we believed. The Dogman sightings in Alaska carry particular weight because of the terrain. We have over 600,000 square miles of largely uninhabited wilderness. Much of it is inaccessible by road. Some of it remains unexplored by modern standards. If you were designing the ideal habitat for a large predator that wanted to avoid sustained human contact, you could not do better than the Alaskan interior. The sightings here cluster around transition zones, where forest meets tundra, where rivers cut through dense brush, where terrain creates natural corridors that funnel both wildlife and human traffic into the same spaces. These are places where Dogman encounters are most likely because both species are using the same landscape features for the same basic reasons: movement, shelter, access to food and water. When I mapped the Alaska Dogman sightings against terrain features and seasonal data, a clear pattern emerged. The sightings cluster in late spring and early fall, periods when wildlife activity peaks and human presence in remote areas increases. During deep winter and high summer, reports drop off sharply. This seasonal pattern is consistent with a real biological entity responding to environmental conditions. Hoaxes and mass hysteria do not follow migration schedules. Real animals do. There is another pattern that took me longer to notice, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. The Dogman sightings increased significantly in years following harsh winters. The theory among the small network of researchers I work with is straightforward. A severe winter reduces the available prey base. Ungulate populations decline sharply as deep snow and extreme cold take their toll. A large predator that normally avoids human contact is then forced to range further from its core territory. It moves into areas closer to human settlements where prey concentrations are higher. That expanded range brings the Dogman into proximity with people who would never normally encounter it, and the sightings spike accordingly. The correlation between hard winters and subsequent Dogman reports is one of the strongest patterns in my entire database. The 2019-2020 winter in interior Alaska was particularly brutal. The following spring and summer produced more Dogman reports than any period in my database. 14 credible sightings in a 5-month window, concentrated in areas where moose populations had been hit hard by the winter conditions. 2 of those sightings were made by wildlife professionals who had no prior knowledge of the Dogman phenomenon and reported what they saw as an unidentified animal. Their descriptions matched every other account in my files. I have built a network over the past 3 years of about 30 individuals across the United States and Canada who take the Dogman phenomenon seriously. They include law enforcement officers, wildlife biologists, forensic analysts, acoustic engineers, and Indigenous elders who serve as cultural consultants. We communicate through secure channels and share evidence carefully. None of us sought out this work. All of us stumbled into it through our professional roles and could not look away once we saw the pattern. One member of this network, a retired wildlife biologist from Montana, spent 2 years analyzing Dogman track casts from 6 different states. His conclusion was that the tracks represent a single unknown species, not multiple different hoaxes or misidentifications. The morphological consistency across tracks collected by different people in different locations over different years points to one biological source. A hoax would show variation. A real species shows consistency. That is basic biology. Another member, a forensic anthropologist, examined the claw marks from several Dogman encounter sites. She determined that the gouges were made by keratin structures, real claws, not metal tools or artificial implements. The depth, angle, and spacing of the marks were consistent across sites hundreds of miles apart. That kind of consistency across distance does not come from coordinated hoaxing. The force required to produce gouges of that depth in hardwood would exceed the capability of any known North American predator, except perhaps a large bear. But the mark pattern didn't match bear claws in any dimension. The spacing was wrong. The angle of entry was wrong. Something else entirely made those marks. The most recent case I investigated, just 4 months ago, involved a pair of utility workers at a remote relay station about 60 miles from the nearest settlement. They arrived in the late afternoon and found the equipment had been tampered with, panels bent, cables pulled loose. The ground showed tracks they initially attributed to a bear, but the damage pattern was wrong. It was methodical. Specific components tested and pulled, as if something was trying to understand how they connected. As darkness fell, the workers heard heavy bipedal footsteps circling the station at a distance of about 40 yards. They aimed flashlights into the trees and caught a reflection. 2 Dogman eyes set wide apart, high off the ground, reflecting amber in the beam. The eyes did not flinch from the light. They held steady, watching with that same patient intelligence that every Dogman witness describes. The workers locked themselves in their truck and waited through the night. The footsteps circled until roughly 3 in the morning, then stopped. In the morning, the workers found Dogman tracks that matched the profile perfectly and drove straight to town. Their report was filed, forwarded to the State Wildlife Division, and within a week a team arrived to inspect the station. The official conclusion was bear damage with overlapping moose tracks. The workers' own photographs were requested for the file and never returned. I have copies of those photographs. They show tracks that are unmistakable to anyone familiar with the Dogman evidence. Large, canine in structure, with proportions matching no known species. The impression depth indicates massive weight. The stride confirms bipedal locomotion. These are clear prints in soft ground, photographed from multiple angles with scale references. There is nothing ambiguous about them. The indigenous traditions deserve more respect than modern institutions give them. The Haudenosaunee people spoke of forest guardians that protected certain territories. Some traditions describe wolf-like beings that stood upright and possessed intelligence rivaling humans. The Algonquin peoples across the Great Lakes had detailed knowledge of territories to avoid, places where the Dogmen demanded respect and distance. These were practical survival protocols, not fairy tales. For those who are interested in more stories like this, consider subscribing. Your support helps keep this investigation alive. European colonizers dismissed these traditions as primitive superstition, the same way they dismissed indigenous knowledge about medicine, ecology, and sustainable land management. We now recognize that much of that dismissed knowledge was scientifically sound. Perhaps it is time to extend the same respect to indigenous accounts of the Dogman. These peoples lived in relationship with the land for thousands of years. They knew what shared the forest with them. I want to address skeptics directly because I respect honest skepticism. It is the engine of good investigation. If you look at any single piece of Dogman evidence in isolation, you can probably find a way to explain it away. A misidentified bear, a hoaxer in a costume, a degraded DNA sample with contamination issues. Taken individually, each piece can be doubted. That is how skepticism works. But I would ask you to consider the totality. Not one piece, but all of them together. Centuries of consistent folklore from unconnected cultures spanning continents. Physical evidence that defies conventional explanation. Behavioral patterns described independently by witnesses who have never communicated with each other. Audio recordings that acoustics experts cannot classify. and an active documented pattern of evidence suppression by entities that should have no reason to hide anything if nothing real exists. Consider the witnesses themselves. I have interviewed dozens personally: hunters, hikers, park rangers, law enforcement officers, military veterans, rural residents who have spent their lives in the outdoors. These are not attention seekers. Many experience real consequences for speaking up: strained relationships, professional difficulties, social ridicule. They gained nothing except the relief of finally telling someone what they encountered. One of the most compelling categories of Dogman encounters involves road crossings. These reports come from drivers on remote highways, often at night, who see a large bipedal figure cross the road ahead of their vehicle. The consistency of these accounts across different states is remarkable. The Dogman crosses with long, fluid strides that cover the full width of a 2-lane highway in 3 to 4 steps. It does not run. It walks with a purposeful gait. It does not appear startled by headlights. In nearly every road crossing case, the Dogman turns its head to look directly at the driver before disappearing into the tree line on the other side. I have 3 such reports from Alaska alone: one from the Parks Highway, one from the Richardson Highway, and one from a gravel road in the Matanuska Valley. All 3 drivers described the same thing. The Dogman crossed unhurried and looked at the vehicle with an expression the witnesses could only describe as contemptuous indifference. These road crossing reports are especially valuable as evidence because they involve clear sight lines, close distances, and the illumination of headlights. These are not brief glimpses in dark forest. These are sustained observations at 50 to 100 feet under direct artificial lighting. The witnesses see the Dogman clearly, and what they describe is always the same: massive canine frame, bipedal stance, muscular build, a head that is unmistakably wolf-like on a body that no wolf has ever possessed. I also want to mention the tree structures. This detail shows up in Dogman reports but gets less attention than the sightings. In multiple cases, witnesses found large branches broken and arranged in patterns near Dogman activity areas, not fallen randomly by wind, placed deliberately, stacked in X patterns or woven between standing trees to create barriers or territorial markers. I found one such structure myself during a field investigation near a sighting location in the Talkeetna Mountains. 3 large branches, each at least 6 inches in diameter, had been broken from living trees at a height of about 7 feet and placed across a game trail in a rough triangle. The breaks were fresh, the wood still green. No storm had passed through recently. No logging activity within 20 miles. Something with enormous strength had snapped those branches from the trunks and arranged them with clear intention. I photographed and measured everything. That evidence sits in my database alongside hundreds of other data points that collectively paint a picture nobody in any official capacity wants to acknowledge. But the picture is there, whether they look at it or not. I do not know exactly what the Dogman is, whether it is a surviving relic species that evolution produced and then concealed in deep wilderness, whether it is something our current science lacks the framework to categorize, whether it is connected to the spiritual traditions of indigenous peoples in ways that Western science cannot measure. I do not have answers to those questions yet. What I have is evidence, and the evidence says the Dogman is real. 3 years of dedicated investigation. 14 documented cases in Alaska alone, physical evidence from 7 of those cases, DNA results that do not match known species, audio recordings that defy classification, a clear seasonal pattern consistent with biological behavior, and a documented trail of evidence suppression that only makes sense if the evidence is genuine. That is where this investigation stands. The file is not closed, it is growing. I have staked my professional reputation on this work. I accepted the costs that come with pursuing something the establishment refuses to acknowledge. I did not choose this investigation. The Dogman evidence chose me, one cold case file at a time, one set of impossible tracks at a time, one shaking witness at a time. And now that I have seen what I have seen, there is no returning to comfortable ignorance. The Dogman is real. The proof exists. And what is being hidden from you is not a matter of national security or public safety. It is institutional cowardice. the unwillingness to admit that the world is bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than the categories we have built to contain it. The folklore always knew, the indigenous peoples always knew, the witnesses know, and now if you have actually been paying attention this whole time, you know too. Stay safe out there. Watch the tree lines, especially at dusk when the light plays tricks and the shadows between the trees seem to move on their own. Trust your instincts when the hair on the back of your neck stands up and every part of your body screams at you to leave immediately. That feeling exists for a reason. It is the oldest alarm system our species possesses, calibrated over millions of years to detect exactly the kind of predator that most people insist cannot possibly exist. But the Dogman does exist. I have the evidence. And someday the rest of the world will have to face that truth whether they are ready for it or not.